The Sony a7 Mark IV has arrived. Is it something worth getting? Hello, my name is Jonathan Palfrey and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe as always, as it massively helps me out. Now today I'm very excited to be showing you the new Sony a7 Mark IV. Now I'm actually quite surprised it came so soon. I was quite late in terms of ordering it. I certainly wasn't one of the first people out there to pre-order this camera. So I didn't expect to be getting it before Christmas, but it arrived about a week and a half ago, and I've had a bit of a chance to play around with it, but not quite enough to really give you a true full review. So I'll be doing that later down the line once we've used this on a few jobs and we've used it with the FX3, being able to better compare the two and also compared to other cameras like the Blackmagic 6K Pro. But for now, I just wanted to give a quick overview of my first impressions of the camera. What things here am I really excited about and what things maybe that I'm a little bit concerned that this camera might not meet expectations. Now, this camera has some pretty big boots to fill. It's, the replacement to the a7 Mark III, which was arguably one of the greatest mirrorless cameras ever made. It ticks so many boxes, and when Sony came out with that camera, it was a huge surprise. It was much cheaper than anyone expected and had much more capability than anyone ever expected. So it was always going to be tough to follow up that camera. We all knew what we wanted from this camera. We wanted that 10-bit color. We wanted 60 frames per second in 4K. And, overall, I've got to say they have delivered. This camera meets those expectations. The image quality is absolutely incredible. But of course, there are certain things that they had to sacrifice to make it all work for the price, or at least just so they could make it so it just doesn't take sales away from the a7S Mark III. So, what are my first impressions of this camera? Now I'm actually going to start with what I'm most excited about this camera, and it's not necessarily the sensor, it's not necessarily the image quality. We all knew that was going to be good, but actually it's the change of the usage of this dial on the end. Now on all Sony cameras, this dial has been the exposure compensation dial, and you've been able to, plus or minus your exposure, your auto exposure by using the dial. Reality is if you're doing manual video or manual photography, it's a kind of a useless feature and never got really used in any scenario. Luckily, Sony have realized that, and rather than just removing it, which is one option they could have done, they've actually put it to better use. So they've got rid of it being a set dial for one thing, and now they let you, the user, set it to whatever you like. And what's really impressive with this whole generation of cameras, and not just this camera, but the FX3 as well, the C70, Blackmagic cameras, they've all got this amazing customizable for buttons and dials, which I don't think really ever existed before. Yes, you could set a dial or a button to do a few features on older cameras, but it was always quite limited, and it'd be frustrating because you'd be like, oh, it'd be really cool if I could set this to that button or that to that button. And often it just wouldn't let you. You'd have a preset list of like, this is what you're allowed, and what you can apply to each setting. This is all changed now with this new generation of cameras. I don't know what kind of forced that change. Maybe it's Blackmagic with their whole new way of interfacing with a camera, and perhaps Red to some degree as well. Having touchscreen controls makes that a lot easier. But to actually allow you to assign anything to pretty much any button and dial, that's where it gets really impressive, and that's where it gets exciting with this. Now there's many options you could set this dial to do. You've already got the other dials on there, so you've got your aperture, your shutter, and your ISO sort of covered anyway, so I wouldn't probably worry about replacing that dial with any of those. But I think where this is useful is to use it as the audio levels dial. Yes, you can actually use this dial to set your audio levels when recording. You might not have a XLR module on the top, but even when you're plugged into the 3.5 on the side, you can actually use this dial to adjust the volume of your mics as you're shooting. That is a really useful feature. And the fact that it also has a locking feature on it, like it used to always have, so you can set it and then make sure it doesn't accidentally get knocked or changed. And in some ways, I think this might even be better than the audio controls that you get on traditional video cameras like the FX3, FX6 and C70, where you have those little dials hidden behind the plastic case. Now the plastic protector works fine, and it stops you from knocking the settings accidentally. But I do find those dials very, very loose, and there's always that risk that if you need to tweak it while, say, you're doing an interview, maybe you're outside and someone speaks louder than expected, or there's noises going on that you didn't have at the beginning of the interview. You're trying to tweak those without, accidentally going far too high or far too low can be quite tough. With this, because it's still a clicky sort of dial and gives you some resistance as you change it, you can be quite confident just tweaking the volume up and down just a few levels, not accidentally going too far. Now, another, I think, underrated feature of this new A7 IV is that the shutter can be set to come down when you have the lens come off and when you turn off the camera. This, I think, is a brilliant feature, and we first saw it on the Canon R, and it just makes so much sense. With these cameras, you don't have that mirror box in there, so the risk of accidentally scratching the sensor or even just getting dust on the sensor, and it's a pain to clean, is much higher with mirrorless cameras than it ever was with DSLRs. And I think just by having that shutter cut down, it just gives you that bit of confidence that hopefully dust won't just kind of float into there as you're changing lenses, or it just reduces the risk of someone accidentally damaging the sensor in that scenario. It can happen, yes, I know it shouldn't happen and very unlikely to happen, but it's nice to know there's at least some level of protection from dust and scratches. Another really cool little feature that Sony have added to the body of this camera, which I hope all Sony cameras going forward actually have, is on the actual dial where you switch between modes. They've actually set the photography, video and S&Q as a separate little switch underneath. Now, it's not a massively new thing to have something like this. We saw it with the Canon cameras in the past, the DSLRs. You'd have a little switch to go between photography and video. But actually, this is such a neat solution and how they've implemented. So it's on the same dials, it's all in the same place where you have your manual and auto control settings. And then you can just easily switch between photography, video and S&Q with just a quick, easy push down and flick of the switch. This is really nice because you can basically do it blind. You don't need to look down at the camera if you want to switch quickly from one mode to another. If you switch the dial right across to the left setting with your finger, you're into photography mode. Switch it all the way far to the right, you're in S&Q mode. That's really handy if you're doing very much a hybrid shoot where you've got to go jumping back and forth between the two. It's not ideal, we don't really want to do it. We want to focus on photography or just on video most of the time when we're shooting. But sometimes, unfortunately, you're in that situation and that's what's required from the shoot. And I think that really, really does help. I think that's a really nice feature as well for people using this as a hobby camera, as a camera that you just take on holiday. Be able to switch between going S&Q mode so you can get some nice slow-mo of the location you're in, then quickly switch and take a photo of that same scene. That is a neat solution to make that work, and much better than having to go through menus or looking down and switching through a dial. Now, the final thing I want to really talk praise about this camera from my initial impressions is the viewfinder. I know apparently this isn't as good as the A7S Mark III. I haven't had a go with that camera yet, so I don't know how good that viewfinder is. But I've got to say, this is pretty damn good. This is more than good enough for most shoot situations. It's bright, it's very sharp, it's easy to use. I would be very, very happy with this viewfinder. I wish the FX3 had a viewfinder. I know you could just buy an A7S III, but I wanted the XLR handle and certain other features of what the FX3 offers. But yeah, having a viewfinder that's good quality like this on a mirrorless camera is always really useful. And I think, there's nothing wrong with this one at all, even if better ones do exist. I think we're at that point now where something like this is more than good enough for most people in most situations. So now let's move on to the not so good, the things that perhaps didn't quite meet our expectations. We've got 10-bit in this camera, and I think it's probably just as good as what you get out of the more expensive cameras. It seems to have the same bit rates and the same codecs, which is brilliant to see in such an affordable camera. So I don't expect the image quality to kind of break down any more than what you would get from a 10-bit FX3 file, for example. So that's really good. And we've obviously got full frame, downscaled 4K at 25 frames and 30 frames, which once again is brilliant that we've got that kind of level of quality. And we probably have a much sharper image because of that downscaling to 4K on the recording. Sadly, where things go downhill a little bit is when it comes to the 4K 50 and 60, and we are losing the full frame ability. Now, Whether this is because of processing limits, you know, a camera of this price range just can't handle the heat maybe, or can't handle the processing needed to be able to do full frame 4K at 60 frames. Maybe that's the reason. Or maybe it's just because Sony wanted to segment out their cameras, which is probably more true, but we don't know what the truth is really when it comes to any of that. Now, it is a shame that there's a crop. It's not ideal. It's much better if you have the same quality in all modes. However, I don't think it's the end of the world. The reason why is when you look at the price bracket that this camera is in, yes, there is the Canon R6, which is a great camera, but it does have those issues of overheating. Maybe that's why cropping is a good idea. But I think actually you're looking at things like the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. Now the 6K Pro is a cropped sensor camera, so there's no option in that. 6K at 60 frames or 50 frames is going to be cropped. So actually this being cropped isn't, to me, the end of the world. You know, it's frustrating to not have full frame in those situations. It's not so bad if you're using this as a B camera like we are, in which case you probably just use the FX3 or the A7S as your main camera for slow-mo anyway. However, it is a compromise that you just have to live with, and we'll have to see whether or not it's too much of a compromise when it comes to my review of this camera. Now, the good news when I've been looking through the settings is actually in HD, there isn't a crop. You can use full frame up to 100 frames per second. The question is whether the quality is going to be good enough. And once again, I've only played around with this camera so far, so I haven't really had a chance to really look at the quality of the HD that's coming out of it. The FX3 HD is incredibly good quality, to the point where actually I'm going to do a video about whether or not you even need to shoot 4K a lot of the time on that camera. It's incredibly sharp. I presume in all modes it's being downscaled properly from the full 4K sensor. The question is whether it's happening in this camera. I've got a feeling that it's probably not being the full sensor being captured and then downscaled. I think we're probably getting some line skipping to avoid the overheating and processor requirements that would be needed to take, you know, 100 frames per second down into HD. I think probably we're getting line skipping, and that's why you can still have the full frame. So that may mean that the image is going to be a bit softer and the quality might not be there, certainly compared to the 4K modes or compared to cameras like the FX3. However, it will be interesting to see what the quality is like and whether or not it is something that is not good enough, or whether the image does hold up well enough and can be used on professional shoots. Because I think if that is possible, then being able to do, you know, HD 50, 60, 100, 120 frames per second full frame on this camera would be brilliant and actually would cover a lot of jobs in the corporate world. Build quality of this camera is fine. It feels a bit plasticky. I don't think it is just plastic. I think it's got the, you know, the alloy body, but you know, it's kind of like coated in that feeling where it doesn't feel maybe as solid as certain other cameras. I certainly think that the cameras like the R and especially the FX3 have a much more stronger build quality feel to them. That said, it's solid, you know, the buttons feel nice, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the camera in terms of its quality for its price bracket. It's certainly better than the Blackmagic 6K Pro. Now for me, the biggest negative of this camera isn't the crop factor. It is the screen on the back. Like all Sony cameras, unfortunately, it has a very small screen and they like to fill it with a lot of information. It's fairly bright and you put it into the high bright mode and it's viewable outdoors, but it's just such a shame that Sony is still putting such small screens on their cameras. I know it would require some readjusting of button placement or maybe requiring a slightly bigger camera, but to be honest, I'd take it. I would really take it. Even the Canon M50 screen looks bigger and brighter than what this camera has got on it. And it's such a shame. I think a camera in 2021 going into 2022 really should have a much bigger screen than this. It's doable, it works, it's fine, and it would have been fine years ago. But I think now, with what you're paying, and when you see the competition, when you see a screen like what you get on the Blackmagic 6K Pro, it's just so hard to go back to something so small. Luckily, the viewfinder is there, and that probably saves the day and makes this camera much more usable. But I do really wish that next time, Sony, please put a bigger screen on the back of your camera. So, do you think this is the ultimate hybrid camera? I think it probably is. I think it really is up there. I think it's going to tick so many boxes. We've got this camera because we wanted a B camera to the FX3 that can do photography and really good video. That's this camera. That ticks those boxes without doubt. If this was your only camera option and you didn't have anything else that you could use, then I think once again, this would still be a brilliant option. You know, it's fairly affordable. Combine this with a Sigma 24-70 lens and you've got a brilliant combination there that will cover you for a vast majority of shoots. You know, you stick a Rode Wireless Go microphone on top and once again, so many sort of shoot situations would be absolutely covered by this camera alone. I really do think, you know, as I've mentioned before in many of my videos, we're reaching that point now where all cameras are absolutely brilliant when it comes to image quality. There's certainly no excuses if you were to purchase this camera that you couldn't get brilliant footage from it. So please let me know what you think. You know, put comments down below at the bottom. Leave any questions you might have about this camera as well, because like I say, I will be doing a full review of this camera later down the line. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please have a brilliant Christmas and New Year. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.